The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hello everybody, and welcome to Unit 2 in the Lunch and Learn series, and this is of course the Executive Management version. So welcome wherever you are, and I hope you're having a good Friday so far. All right, so normal process here is if you've got any questions or you've got any comments or observations, please type them in the question box over on the right-hand side. And the good news is that I will see those immediately and I'll respond to them. Bearing in mind, I'm of course the only one that will see the questions, and I'll respond nevertheless the moment I see them. And that way you don't have to store up all your questions towards the end of the presentation. We have an awkward pause while people are trying to remember what questions they wanted to ask. The other important point is that at the end of this presentation, you'll receive a copy of the slides and the recording. So this is being recorded, and so please relax. You don't need to take a lot of notes, just a matter of tuning in. And of course, you can review all of this later on. All right, so let's move on to the topics that we're going to cover. These are the 6 topics that are in front of you. We, of course, last time we met, we talked about strategically managing performance. You'll notice they're around in the opposite way. So we actually looked at strategically managing performance, and then we looked today, or will look at today, as enhancing your personal influence at the executive level. So I hope you've had a chance to complete your influencing capabilities profile, because this is very much a debrief on that profile. But if you haven't completed it, that's fine, because you'll get a chance to complete it at the end of this, and perhaps this might be a precursor to that. So either way, of course, you'll get some valuable information today that will help you understand your profile and how you like to influence people. And in Unit 3, we'll look at creating thinking space and managing time. We're all time poor, and we need to find that space to think, because really at the executive level, we are paid to think, and we'll look at that very much in Unit 3. In Unit 4, we'll look at organisational structures and how you might restructure your department or your organisation overall, and what are your options. So how might you go about that? In Unit 5, we'll look at negotiation and conflict resolution, and the reality is that 2 people on a desert island, there'll be some degree of conflict. The question is not how do we avoid it. The question is what do we do when we're faced with it, and how might we deal with it as effectively and efficiently as we probably can. And then in Unit 6, we'll look at creating culture, the right positive culture that you might need in order for your organisation to thrive and prosper in a climate of accelerated change and uncertainty. So that's essentially the 6 units, and so let's get stuck into Unit 2, which of course is the influencing capabilities profile that I mentioned earlier. Now, 4 things that I want to get from this particular presentation today. I do want to look at what we mean by influence, because I think sometimes when people see the word influence, they often think about manipulation or being cunning or underhanded or something of that nature. It's not really about that at all. It's actually about doing things willingly and ethically. And so I do want to talk about that a bit. I want to talk about the influencing capabilities framework, and this is a framework that I put together because I recognized when I was looking and investigating this whole notion of influence that at one end of the continuum, we had very academic types material, which really wasn't applicable for somebody in a leadership role. And then at the other end of the continuum, we had lots of sales type material, which was great if you're in a sort of retail selling scenario. But of course, that in itself wasn't relevant to the leader either. So I was very interested in something right smack bang in the middle between those 2 variables, and that's why I put together the influencing capabilities framework, which I'll share with you shortly. And of course, we'll look at the 4 influencing strategies, and if you've done the profile, you'll be aware of what your preferred strategy is already. And the question then is not to overuse it, but rather to use it and be aware that there are 3 other strategies that are equally important depending on the circumstances that you're in or the people that you're influencing. And then finally, I'm going to share with you a couple of tools that you can use to improve your capacity to influence. And they're very practical. My book, The New Influencing Toolkit, covers 64 tools. I'm not going to cover 64, obviously, in this short session, but what I'll do is I'll cover some that you could virtually use this afternoon if you choose to do that. All right, so that's what we're covering, and so let's have a look at these 4 leaders, and I'd like you to have a think about these 4 leaders, and what I'd like you to do is to think about what they've got in common. So what do these 4 leaders have in common, do you think? So you probably recognize them, and I'm sure in many cases you could also identify who they are. One thing, of course, they all have in common is that they are famous. I mean, we've all recognized those faces somewhere. And I can say to you that 4 of them, or 3 of them, are no longer with us, and 1 is still with us. So they've all been famous, they've all been highly influential, and they've all made a difference in the world that we live in. I haven't used these 4 characters because they happen to be role models of mine, but rather because they've been extremely influential, and also because I wanted to be politically correct. I made sure that we had a good balance between male and female, and also right-wing and left-wing politics, so that, and of course across a number of industries as well. So I've made sure that I've balanced these up as much as I can, but the bottom line is that each of these 4 have or were highly influential, and they each used a particular influencing strategy, and we'll look at those very shortly. Of course, if you've done the profile, you'd be aware that you could click on the links, and the links will actually show you the video clips of these 4 leaders in action. So starting clockwise and over on the left-hand side, we have Al Gore, former Vice President of the United States and climate change activist. We have Martin Luther King. Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1969. He produced probably one of the greatest speeches ever, I Have a Dream, in 1968, and it moved a generation and created a huge amount of awareness around the whole notion of civil rights. And he, of course, was a civil rights activist. Then we have Margaret Thatcher, the former Great Britain Prime Minister, who was Prime Minister for 10 years, the only female Prime Minister of Great Britain, and somebody that people either loved or hated. There was very little sort of middle ground there, because people knew exactly where they stood with Margaret Thatcher. And then finally at the bottom we have Mother Teresa, who of course was anointed to sainthood not so long ago, who did some enormously important work in the poor, poverty-stricken areas of Calcutta and other parts of the world for the extremely poverty-stricken people in those areas. So each of them have their own particular bend or area of influence, but each of them arguably was highly influential in their own way. And of course I'm going to refer to them a little bit later on in the presentation. Now, let's just understand before we go any further about what influence is and what it isn't. Because as I mentioned before, influence in my view is not around manipulation. Influence, as I've got there, and this is my definition, of course you can get, if you Google influence, you'll get lots of definitions, but my definition is the power to make other people agree with your opinions or get them to do what you want willingly and ethically. So there's a couple of key points there. Yes, it is about power, and it could be about 2 things. It could be about getting other people to do something different, such as a project, or it could be to get them to think differently about something. So it could be about changing people's thinking or changing people's behaviour. And the second important part of that is that we want to do this willingly. In other words, people are doing it because they themselves can see the sense in being influenced by you in a certain way, and also that it's done in an ethical way. In other words, a transparent way. People actually understand what's happening and are quite willing to change either their point of view or their behaviour as a result of your influence. So that's my definition of influence. So if you've got any comments or questions, by all means type them in the box over there on the right hand side. Now, the truth of the matter is that all of us are in the business of being of influence. So we go home this evening and we want to influence our children. If we've got children, we want to influence our partner. If we've got a partner, we have stakeholders we want to influence. We have people we want to influence. And our day is spent attempting, wherever possible, to successfully influence other people. And of course, other people are trying to do the same thing as far as we're concerned. So as an executive, you are actually in the business of influence. And so therefore it makes sense that if you're in that business, then you need to get good at it. And that's exactly what I intend to share with you on how you might do that. Now, there are 3 influencing variables that are important, and I want to run through those with you and just share with you what those variables are. So one of the variables in any influencing situation is your particular profile. Now, if you've completed the influencing capabilities profile, you would already know what your profile is. So your profile, of course, is the preferred way that you like to influence other people. And interestingly enough, the way you like to be influenced is often the way you like to influence other people. So for example, if you like using logic and fact and rationale and be quite structured in your approach to influence, that's how you will tend to influence other people, and that's how other people, if they want to be influential with you, would influence you. So we've all got our preferred style. The problem is, of course, that our preferred style and approach is not always the preferred style and approach of other people. So what happens, of course, is that we try harder and harder to influence people based on how we see the world. And of course, sometimes we forget that other people may well have an influencing style or approach that's quite different to ours. So that's the first variable. And of course, what the influencing capabilities profile does is it sensitizes you to the fact that there are 4 influencing strategies, and that you should be using all 4 and not heavily relying too much on your preferred influencing strategy. The second variable, of course, is the person or persons that you're influencing also has their own style and approach as well. And of course, it's not convenient to give people a copy of the influencing capabilities profile, but what we do is we kind of make some judgments about how people like to be influenced. So the larger the group, so for example, if you have to give a presentation, you have to influence a large group of people, the law of averages would suggest that there are people in that audience who probably have one of those 4 strategies or prefer one of those 4 strategies. So your job as a presenter, of course, is to try to use all 4 strategies in your presentation. And by doing that, you're likely to be more influential because you'll likely hit the mark with everybody in the audience at some point, if that makes sense. Now, of course, there's another variable, and that is the situation that you're in. Some situations require quick action, others require deliberation, others require collaboration. So depending on the circumstances you're in can very much dictate which of those 4 strategies is the appropriate way to go. Now, of course, when we're put into an influencing situation, we're often not agile enough to sit there and consider those 3 variables or those 3 dimensions. So what we tend to do is we just bang on with our own particular style or approach and just hope, like anything, that we'll ultimately be successful. And that often won't happen. So what we've got to do is, if plan A doesn't work, excuse me, if plan A doesn't work, we should be trying plan B or plan C or even plan E. Whatever might work. In other words, what we should be doing is trying to use all four strategies in their right place and in their right time with the right people. So that's the three dimensions that are critically important in any influencing situation. So let's have a look at the influencing capabilities profile now. So what you're seeing on your screen right now, of course, is my influencing capabilities framework. And what you'll notice up the top is the first column, there's a push style, and the second column is a pull style. Now, let me give you a definition of what I mean by push and pull. This may help. So if you notice there, the push style is very much around the driving and proposing and giving information and blocking and shutting out other people's points of view. So it's very one-dimensional, and it's very assertive. And then on the other hand, the pull style is much more collaborative, enabling. It's responding and working with the views of other people. So you have the push or the pull style. Now, in your influencing capabilities profile, you will have got a score, a percentage, to demonstrate which of those two styles you favour. And if you had a score that's fairly even, then obviously you feel comfortable either using a push or a pull style. But of course, if one is significantly different to the other, then it's highly likely that you use that style perhaps too often. And perhaps what I would suggest to you is that you need to vary your style somewhat so that you incorporate both a push and a pull style, because both of them have their place in the right circumstances. And over here, you've got the logic and emotional approaches. Now, let me put up a little slide to show you what the logic and emotional approaches are all about. So you can notice there that the logical approach is very much based on facts and logic and evidence, very much around structure and measurement and numeric numbers. So people who prefer to influence via logic will tend to gravitate towards those sorts of things. On the other hand, of course, those who prefer to influence using an emotional approach would use feelings and incorporate values and perceptions, be quite flexible and be very conscious and aware of the importance of morale. So it's the opposite type of approach. And again, if you look on your influencing capabilities profile, which has the highest percentage? And if they're fairly even, then obviously you're comfortable using either a logical or emotional approach. But if one dominates the other, it's likely that one is going to be probably more preferenced by you in most influencing situations. And my advice to you would be to try to be flexible in your approach and use both approaches. So we end up then with four particular influencing strategies. We have investigation, which is a push logical strategy. We have calculation, which is a pull logical strategy. We have motivation, which is a push emotional strategy. And we have collaboration, which is a pull emotional strategy. And again, on your influencing capabilities profile, you would have ended up with a score around each of those four influencing strategies. And the one that had the highest score is perhaps the one that you feel most comfortable using when you're influencing other people. If there's a fairly even score across all four, then it's highly likely that you'll use all four in different circumstances and with different people, which is great. But if there's one that dominates, it's highly likely that you need to probably vary your style and perhaps use the ones that are less comfortable for you in certain circumstances, so that you become more flexible in your influencing approach. All right, so hopefully that makes sense to you, and what I'm going to do now is move on and show you the influencing capabilities that underpin each of those 4 approaches. So what you can see here is you can see on your screen, for example, it hasn't quite come up yet by the look of it. Maybe if I get rid of the video, let's see if that's come up. Anyway, I'll keep talking about that. It looks like, here we go. Looks like it might have come up now. Anyway, look, in the question box there, just let me know if there's any issues around that, coming up on your screen. It just indicates it's not come up on your screen. But anyway, let me plow on. So really, in the influencing capabilities profile, there are actually 4 capabilities that underpin each of the influencing strategies. So you get a very useful page in your profile that shows you that there are 16 capabilities overall. And it gives you a percentage around how comfortable you are using that particular capability. So obviously in investigation, you can see that gathering evidence, countering arguments, asserting ideas and generating ideas are 4 underpinning capabilities that very much support the investigation strategy. So when you look at, and of course this isn't my profile if you're wondering, but what you can see in front of you is somebody's profile. And the first interesting thing about this profile is that over here on the left-hand side, this person is clearly a more dominant in the logical approach to influence, with 70% versus 53. So that's not so even. Whereas up the top, they are quite prepared to use a push or a pull style depending on circumstances or people that they're working with. So my first advice, if I was giving this person some coaching, would probably be to suggest that they should be exercising more emotional approaches to influence when the situation arises, and to be aware of those situations. Now, the percentages around the 16 influencing capabilities can tell a bit of a story, because what you're looking for on this screen is the areas where you have relative high scores and areas where you have relative low scores. Now you can see that there are relative low score here around offering concessions, 33%. So my suggestion to this person would be to find opportunities in the day-to-day workplace and with stakeholders where you can offer concessions, because by doing that, of course, you are going to be building up that influencing capability. On the other hand, if you look over here, there's 83% in gathering evidence. So this person's got a very high preference around collecting data, gathering evidence, whatever you might want to call it. They also have a very strong preference around communicating openly. So they're going to be strengths of this person, but of course it could also be a weakness in the sense that they may overuse those capabilities when in fact they should be using other capabilities. So that's a very effective, that's a very interesting and useful slide on your profile that will give you as a snapshot where you need to be spending your energy and where not to be expending too much energy where you have the relative high scores. So this person overall is an investigator. So they pretty much enjoy the gathering evidence and generating ideas and countering arguments, and to a lesser extent asserting those ideas. So that's who they are, and I'd be recommending that they start looking over here, perhaps underneath in the emotional side, and look at some of these areas that perhaps have a lower preference, such as connecting emotionally and so forth. All right, so you can see how you can gain a lot by looking at that. So if you've got any questions, by all means, go ahead and ask. Now what I'd like to do is just actually go into more detail and look at the 4 influencing capabilities, the 4 influencing strategies, and actually have a look at each of these strategies in some detail, which will help you, of course. So we have the Inquisitive Investigator. They, of course, as I mentioned earlier, like to use facts and logic and structure around their arguments, and they'll tend to persuade people in a very methodical and structured way. And of those 4 famous people that we showed you earlier, Al Gore would be the person who would be most likely to use investigation as a strategy when he is trying to influence other people. And if you get a moment, have a look on YouTube at his video, The Inconvenient Truth, which was a video that he put together after losing the United States presidential election of 2000 against George W. Bush. He went and reinvented himself, and what he did, of course, is if you look at that video, you'll notice it's chock-a-block full of graphs and charts and statistics and analysis, generally speaking, and it very much depicts his particular influencing strategy or style and approach. So inquisitive investigators, you'll find them in the police. Of course, the police in any culture is about collecting evidence, putting a case before a jury, and a compelling case that may convict the person that's been found guilty. You've got scientists and researchers. Scientists and researchers will usually have a hypothesis that they're trying to prove or disprove, and what they'll use is a reputable system, normally of methodology, if you like, research methodology, which will demonstrate conclusively that hypothesis is either true or not true, or perhaps inconclusive, whatever the case may be. So there are people that will actually rely on this to influence and be influential. So any workplace incident, such as safety or harassment, that's an incident where you would, these would be circumstances where you would actually use a report, you collect data, and then you assemble a conclusion out of that information, which hopefully would be influential on the basis of the rigor of the research that you've done. But you wouldn't use this approach for large-scale change, because where you want to get people on board is usually an emotional type of response, winning the hearts and minds of people. And in order to do that, you need to perhaps use more of an emotional approach to influencing people. All right, so moving on to the clear calculator, and you can see a picture on the right-hand side of former Great Britain Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. So calculators will have a tendency to promote the positives of a proposal and highlight the weaknesses of the current position. So what they'll do is they'll talk up the positives and perhaps talk about the weaknesses of not going down the road. So I'll give you an example of this. It's very powerful. I walked past a retail outlet the other day, a technology outlet in Australia called Harvey Norman's, and on the door was a sign saying 40% off all laptops, which is a pretty attractive type of message. I wasn't planning to go into the store, but thought, well, I might as well go in because that's a pretty good deal. I walked into the store, and as soon as I came into the store, there was another sign in front of me saying that in order to get your 40%, you must purchase by the close of business today. So basically, I had no choice but to purchase my laptop today in order to get that 40% advantage. So that's a classic retail strategy to talk up the positives of the proposal, and all the while putting in a negative around, if you don't act now, there will be a result. Now, Margaret Thatcher was a past master at that, where you knew where you stood with her. She would talk up the advantages of a particular situation, and she would attempt to prosecute the disadvantages of not going down that road. And of course, they still use logic in their approach. It's just that they do it in a slightly different way. So salespeople, as I mentioned, are very much versed in this. Financial advisors, the best deal going, and you need to get in now on the ground floor, that type of scenario. Animal trainers will often use, when you go to a circus, you'll notice that the animal trainer will often have a whip in one hand and treats in the other, and they will coax the animals to do their impressive feats either with a light whipping or with some treats. So they'll use this pros and cons type approach to get animals to do things that they want them to do. So any workplace change that you're undergoing in your organisation that will affect employees on a personal level and the way they like to operate, it's very important that you then talk up the pros of the new situation. So it might be a new customer relationship management system. So you talk up the benefits of it, but you also talk up the disadvantages of not adopting this new approach. So it leverages employees into a situation where they have to accept the new arrangement because there's a compelling case for it and a compelling case against not accepting it. So where you wouldn't use it, of course, is situations where the direction is vague and unclear. So your belief that we should create a new market or a product, for example, people need to be convinced about that before you start talking up pros and cons. So, if you use any of these situations in the wrong, any of these strategies in the wrong situation, you're likely not to get the best result. So let's talk about the mindful motivator. Now, the mindful motivator is a person, now the next two, of course, are below the line. And what I mean by that is that these two individuals or people below the line use and rely on emotion rather than logic. So that's the big difference. So the mindful motivator will tend to use emotions to influence. So they're usually big picture thinkers, and they will draw people to a clear idea or a compelling vision of the future. A good example of that, of course, is an entrepreneur like an Elon Musk, who will draw people to his vision of the future because he's painted a very compelling picture of the future. So whether this is Mars exploration or, driverless cars or whatever it might be, the leader is influencing people by selling a picture of the future. So they'll often have a way with words, and they can define, they can usually define a vision as very compelling, convincing, and fairly simple to understand. And Martin Luther King was one of those influencers who, when he gave a speech, would use wonderful phrases and rhetoric rather than logic. So if you actually go onto YouTube and type in "I have a dream" and watch his speech, you will note that there are absolutely no facts in that speech whatsoever, but there's lots of beautiful phrases and rhetoric that he will use to convince and convey and persuade. So Dr. Martin Luther King is a good example of a mindful motivator. So you've got, as I mentioned earlier, advertising executives, you've got entrepreneurs, you've got public relations agents, you've got artistic directors. Now, all of these people, of course, will use different approaches and styles, and they'll use it to great effect, because they've only got a very small window or moment, particularly a public relations agent. And so what they'll use is they'll tug at the heartstrings rather than explain any sort of logic, because that takes some time. And so any advertisement that we might see on social media or on the television will use a vision to tug at the heartstrings. So if you're developing a new initiative, a new strategic direction, for example, you want to win the hearts and minds of people. And obviously, if you're winning the hearts of people, you need to use an emotional approach. And of course, motivation is that approach. So you need to give people a very clear and compelling reason why we are moving in the direction that you propose. And if they're sold on that, then they're on board. But on the other hand, you shouldn't use this approach when people aren't clear about the reason or rationale for a new initiative. So for example, if all of a sudden there was budgetary cuts in your business or organisation, and these budgetary cuts were quite deep, it's no good you trying to motivate people. People are actually very interested in the facts of the situation up front. They want to know what the size of the cuts are, where they'll take place, and perhaps when they'll take place. And that's what they want before anything else. So again, if you use the wrong strategy in a situation, you're likely not to be effective. And finally, we have, of course, Mother Teresa, and this is the collegial collaborator. So collaborators will tend to influence, again, using emotion, but the big difference between the collaborators and the motivators is that the collaborators will tend to draw people towards one another. In other words, they'll be team players or team builders. So there's a tendency that they will start to build an esprit de corps, as the French would say, amongst their particular team. And so they will engage people's hearts and minds, and Mother Teresa was able to do that and garner a lot of voluntary help in her quest to deal with the poor people on the streets of Calcutta and other parts of the world. And of course, she got lots of NGOs and government agencies involved in that quest. And it was because she was able to collaborate and bring coalitions of support together. So, collaborators. There are a number of professions out there that will use collaboration as an influencing strategy. Conductors of an orchestra, for example, don't play a musical instrument, but yet they are able to create a beautiful ensemble by drawing in the various sections of an orchestra in terms of when they are about to contribute to the ensemble. Funeral directors, of course, have to work with usually a wide coalition of people who perhaps don't want to be at the funeral, and they have to make it all work and come together at the last minute, as do choreographers who are putting a show together, have to deal with a whole bunch of very ego-driven artists, and has to get people to work closely together for the benefit of the show. So this is a very powerful strategy when in circumstances where you have diverse and strongly held views in your team. So if people have a different point of view, or you've got some factions developing in your team, the very best thing you can do is get them all together and give them an opportunity to express their counter views, respectfully of course, and to actually get people to listen to those points of view. And while that's happening, what will happen is that people will at least get to understand why people have a point of view the way they do. Of course, a lot of senior managers don't do this, and what they do is they sweep these differences under the carpet, or let sleeping dogs lie, as the saying goes. Now, that's not a good strategy, because all that does is solidify the points of view, and it just entrenches the points of view, and so it doesn't make things any better. In fact, in many ways, it makes things worse. So talking out differences of point of view is an important part of the work of a collaborator. But where it won't work is where people need to know the logic. They need to know the logic or rationale of a particular perspective. All right, so if if you're introducing a CRM system into your business, people will actually want to know why. They want to know why before how we're going to make this work as a team, which of course is the question that the collaborators attempt to answer. But they want to know in the big picture why that is the case. All right. So those are the 4 different styles. If you've got any questions or comments or observations, type them in the question box there, because I'll be happy to respond to those in due course. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you've got this page that comes up in your influencing capabilities profile, which I think you'll find very useful. So when you get your profile, the key thing for you is to look at the profile and to work out where you need to be spending more energy than you currently are. So the first thing, of course, to look at is the push-pull style and your percentages. Then go to the logic and emotional approaches and look at your percentages. Then go to your influencing strategies and look at the broad percentages. So for example, the calculation strategy there in front of you is 65%. That's made up of those 4 underpinning capabilities. So that's where that number comes from. And so you're looking then at your strategies, and then the final part of your analysis is to look carefully at the 16 capabilities and to work out which of those 16 capabilities dominate and which of those 16 capabilities perhaps you could use more in the future. And of course, the whole purpose of this profile is so that you are more flexible and more malleable or more adaptable in your circumstances when you're dealing with other people and situations. So people who are highly influential using this model are people who are prepared to flex and change and accommodate depending on the circumstances that they're in. And this is very important. I mentioned earlier, and we had a question about this earlier, that which style or approach do I use if I'm giving a presentation? And at your senior level, it's probably likely that you will get lots of opportunity to give presentations to various groups of various sizes. I think the best way to prepare for that, and normally when you do have to give a presentation, you're trying to convince a group of people of a course of action or a way of thinking. And my suggestion for that is for you to structure your presentation around the 4 influencing strategies. So for example, in the early stages of your presentation, you might give people the facts. So you might explain the situation as it is. So in that sense, you're using the investigation strategy to give a clarity around what the pitfalls of the current situation are and perhaps what the benefits are, but people can see that you are very much in command of the facts of the situation. You then might sort of let people know what your approach is or your way of thinking, and you might also link your way of thinking to the strategic direction of the organisation. So you might link it back to the values of the organisation or the big picture or the vision statement itself. So by doing that, of course, we're now using motivation. And then you might then ask people for some questions, and you might actually involve people in a collaboration. And by collaborating with people, there's a tendency that you are getting them to be involved in the process of change. And then finally, I might actually have a slide which over on the left-hand side might say, here are all the compelling reasons for change. And on the right-hand side, you might have a couple of bullet points explaining what the consequences are of not changing. So now I'm using calculation. So you can see that if you use those 4 consciously in a presentation, it's highly likely that you're going to be very influential. And you probably are likely to hit the mark with every person in the audience at some point in your presentation, which is precisely how you should go. Of course, the opposite is just go ahead with what you favour. And of course, that's not likely to be very influential with those that don't have a similar sort of influencing profile to yourself. So hopefully that gives you some idea about how you might use this in large-scale influencing situations. I just want to wrap up now and just talk about some tools that you might use in terms of influencing that might be effective for you. So you can use third-party endorsements if you are trying to use investigation. Third-party endorsements of people of high credibility who have been there, done that. So for example, if you're implementing a change in your industry or your organisation, you might call upon somebody else or at least quote them on what they have experienced through the change process. And authors do this all the time, and book publishers, that on the back cover of a book you've got somebody of note who's made usually hopefully a complimentary comment about the author and why you should buy that book, because that's a third-party endorsement. So use them very well. I talk a bit more in detail about that in my book. Structured interviews, of course, is usually how we recruit people, or select people, I should say. We tend to ask the same questions to each candidate on the shortlist. And what we're doing there is getting some consistency that perhaps will give us an opportunity to be able to validate somebody who we believe is the best person for that job. So structured interviews have a credibility because they are structured. And of course, if you've got to do any investigations, if you ask different people the same questions, you could argue that you're being very consistent and objective in your approach. Conducting any surveys, and one of the reasons that surveys are so popular worldwide and in organisations is because they're very effective at influencing. So when we get results out of a survey, assuming they're done rigorously, there's a tendency that those results can be quite influential. And of course, as you can see on your page there, we've got process mapping, which is really just mapping out a particular process that occurs in your business. Now, if you do this in front of your team and you involve them in the process mapping exercise and you talk about some of these key decision points, then you're actually using investigation and collaboration, aren't you? Because you're engaging people and you're using an investigation tool, you're actually combining two approaches. And whenever you do that, you're actually going to be far more influential. So let's look at the calculation strategy. Now, calculation, probably the most well-known strategy there is what we call a force field analysis. Kurt Lewin put this together years ago, and what he was arguing is that whenever we've got to make a decision or there's a change that needs to occur, the idea is that we draw a line down the center of the page, and then on the right-hand side, we write down all the driving forces for change. So what are all the forces in favor of the change? So we consider all of those forces, and then on the other side, we write down all of the restraining forces, or the forces that are likely to get in the way and prevent the change from occurring, or at least not occurring smoothly. And then the argument is which has the greatest force, the driving forces or the restraining forces. And then what we can do is we can manipulate those forces to create a better outcome. Now again, if you do this collectively with your team, when you're making a decision, you're involving two influencing strategies, calculation and collaboration. And that can be very, very effective. When you've got cost-benefit analyses, that can be very powerful. So if the benefits of the change outweigh the costs, and it can be demonstrated to be the case, then it's likely that you're going to be influential. On the other hand, if the costs ultimately outweigh the benefits, you might want to rethink the proposal, or at least try and trim the costs so that the benefits do outweigh the costs. And an after-action review is something that occurs in the military, that after an event, people will sit down and basically answer three key questions. What went well, what didn't go well, and what will we do differently next time? Which is a very powerful set of questions to be able to learn from a process. So what went well, what didn't go well, and what will we do differently next time, if there is, of course, a next time. So there's three strategies there that you could use. In terms of motivation, and incidentally, there's a picture, of course, of Steve Jobs there, and we would argue that he was clearly favoured the motivation style, was explaining things in terms of visionary, as a visionary. So you can use what I have put together as a team values charter, which essentially means that you can sit people down in a team and ask them, if there was one value, 4 questions essentially you ask, and you get everyone to write the answers down to these 4 questions. If there was one value that was important to you in working in this team, what would it be? So that's your first question. Everyone writes down, so I might write down respect. Question 2 is, how do you define that value? So I might write down respect means being willing to listen to the points of view of other people. Question 3 is, why is it important to you? I might say, well, respect's important to me because I want to feel that I have a contribution to make in this team. And question 4 would be, what behaviours would demonstrate that value? So I might write down listening to people, even if I disagree with them, and listening to their point of view before I interrupt. So you can, and then you get people to read those out, and you've created for yourself a team values charter. And of course you can publish that. And one of the benefits of that is that everybody owns a piece of it. Everyone has a value in that charter, and they're likely to adhere to that charter. And it's a good way of being able to galvanise people towards a set of values. The GROW model, John Whitmore's GROW model, and when someone comes to you to interrupt you and you think to yourself, well, really people can resolve that themselves, they don't need me, you can ask them 4 simple questions. G stands for grow. What's the goal? Or what are you aiming to do? G stands for goal, sorry. What are you aiming to do? R stands for reality. What are the barriers in the way that are preventing you from doing this? O stands for options. What are your options? And you'll notice it's plural, so we're looking for more than one. And W is what next? What do you need to do next? So GROW works really well. Storytelling is very powerful, and tell a story about yourself, and tell a story where you got it wrong. And then you bring in humility. And if you can tell a story where you made a mistake in the past as a way of indicating to people how they should not do it, you will find that's much more effective than giving them a pep talk or a lecture. And why not start your meetings with a good news story? So why don't go around the table and say one win for the week. So it staggers me how few teams actually use this, but it also staggers me how effective it is and how simple it is to implement, and yet most teams don't do it. So there's some simple strategies. In terms of collaboration, do what the late and great Stephen Covey talked about in his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Begin with the end in mind. So get your group together, explain to them what your end goal is. In other words, at the end of this meeting, I'm expecting us to come up with a solution to this problem. I don't care how we get there, I just simply want us to collaborate and work together to come up with that solution. And then you set them free for the hour until they come up with a solution. That can be quite effective, and of course you can gently remind them throughout the course of the hour that time is marching on and that people do need to come up with a suggestion before the end of the hour. Giving any sort of feedback is a collaboration skill, because you're expecting people to give personal feedback about how they went about what they did first and foremost. And paraphrasing and actively listening to other people is a fundamental collaborative skill that will obviously help people engage with you. So there are a lot of different possibilities there that you can use. Right, so folks, that pretty much brings us to the end, and what I want to do now is pretty much give you some homework to do, which is the normal process in these sessions. What I'd like you to do is to complete the profile if you haven't already done it, and if you have done it, then I'd like you to try and alter or change your approach and style to accommodate all 16 capabilities. So in other words, I want you to have some fun with this and start to use this with your boss, stakeholders that you work with, both internal and external, your team members, and other people that you interact with on a daily basis. In other words, I want you to consciously be aware of influence. And so that's pretty much it, and brings us to an end. So I'd like to thank you all for the opportunity of working with you today, And I wish you all the very best in terms of your ability to influence people. And if you've got any questions or comments, more than happy for you to send me an email and let me know your success. Thank you, folks. All the very best. Goodbye.